In this video we're going to explore the topic of assembling flourishes within the software. This is not designed to be a scientific study of creating decorative architectural elements, but more a set of hints, tips, tricks and ideas that I've picked up over the years in creating these types of shapes. So let's look at a more specific agenda for the next few minutes. So firstly, we'll just take a look at the topic in general, and I'll describe what I mean by a flourish, because it's not a technical term, it's just what I tend to call these sort of decorative elements. Then we'll look at some typical applications and shapes that we might find in architecture, carvings, furniture, that type of thing. Then we'll look at some of the typical features of a flourish, so things like the way that a lot of them have symmetry, and we'll start to explore those ideas. Then we'll take that a stage further, where we come to look at how we might want to create our own flourishes and assemblies of these flourishes. So we'll look at how we start from scratch, how we define what we want to make. We'll explore in much more detail the shapes and patterns that are involved in these and how to identify them so that we can recreate them. And then we'll look at the topic of why we might want to start with an existing piece of clip art and edit that rather than work from scratch. Finally, we'll just summarize everything that we've talked about. So what do I mean when I refer to a flourish? Basically, it's decorative ornamentation that's typically added to another part in order to make it more attractive. Throughout history, flourishes have been used in lots of different ways in order to make things look more beautiful. There are lots of historical styles. You can see some of them listed on the screen here. Some very common ones in architecture are Greek, Roman, neoclassical. There's lots of rules behind those. And then again, throughout history, every period has its own style that may be evolved from one of the previous ones, or may really kind of evoke a new age when you get to things like Art Nouveau and Art Deco. Throughout history also you'll find lots of typically recurring themes, and you'll see this occur throughout the slides here. So things like leaves, flowers, scrolls, animals, shells, heraldic objects and many other things of which there are lots of different versions of. So let's take a look at some of the typical applications where flourishes might be used. One type of flourish is the kind of applique, onlay, or something where it might be slightly recessed in an inlay, and this is essentially a sort of standalone shape that's been added on to a flat area of a part in order to create decoration. We've got wall and ceiling panels, very typical that in historical buildings flourishes were used to add more interest, particularly if the owner was wealthy. Furniture can be very nice to even put just a small carved part on a piece of furniture to make it look that much more unique or attractive. Doors and cabinets, again with historical styles, you'll typically find some additional carving on doors or cabinets or the panels within them. Mantles make excellent use of flourishes with things like the leaves on the corbels or the shell in the main part here, or even like the egg and dart running along the bottom of the top piece of this mantle. Some other applications, posts or finials like the one you can see here. Mouldings or crown mouldings, so essentially where you've got something repeating in a straight line. Borders and frames, so there's a pretty ornate example in the image there. Arches, so these are similar to sort of mouldings and crown, except typically you might find that it's just been bent around an arc, and that's something that the software is very good at doing. Boxes, adding decoration to boxes, or even clocks, again on more historic clocks particularly. And even adding embellishment to signs to make a sign a little bit more attractive or create more interest in it. So this is just a few examples of where you might find these and some photos of the way that they might be used. Now if we drill down a bit further, we can start to look more specifically at the types of shapes that the flourishes occupy. Here we've got one that's situated within a horizontal rectangle in effect. We have vertical ones, so similar idea, and these are often referred to as drops. We've got a corner, lots of different aspect ratios of corners. Here we've got a corner that actually kind of follows an arch as well as sitting in the corner. Rosettes, so essentially repeating motifs that go around a central focus. Keystone, so the top middle part of an arch with the angled sides here. A swag, so this kind of curved drop down shape often may have flowers or plants or leaves or something in it. That's referred to as a swag. Have capitals, typically sitting on the top of a column. A cartouche, which is this sort of almost a little bit like a shield, but kind of an oval shape typically, or round, and then may have this scroll work coming up from it. Corbels, as we can see here. Really, there are many other types of shapes as well, so we've just picked out some of the more typical ones that we might come across, and you may be interested to know what they're referred to. So having sort of explored the idea of what flourishes are and the types of shapes they're typically used for, before we get into looking at creating these things ourselves, it's good to understand some of the specific sort of features that we might find within their design. Often you're going to see lots of these that have symmetrical layouts. So like the image you can see here, the corners have basically horizontal and vertical symmetry, and then the rosette in the middle has a sort of rotational symmetry where we've got 1/5 of it highlighted with the triangle there, and that could just be repeated around the center. And we're going to look in much more detail at these different topics a little bit later. As well as lines of symmetry, we may find sort of more complex rotational symmetry. So there in the center we've got a repeating motif, and even as we step out you can see that that kind of highlighted leaf pattern there is just repeated around 6 times in order to create the next level within that design. Overlaps, quite often we might take sort of an individual motif like a leaf or something, and as we rotate it around, overlap it in order to create more interest, or maybe even a more detailed design like the one you can see here that has the sunflowers and then has a ribbon flowing around those in order to create a really interesting corner design. Quite often we'll find that these have a central focus, so something in the middle. In a rosette there's often something in the middle, and even in the kind of horizontal layouts we'll quite often find that there might be a central symmetry, so that something is placed in the middle there to focus our eyes on, and everything kind of cascades away from that shape. Talking of cascading shapes, that's quite a typical feature. So there you can see how they've sort of taken the leaf motif, and although it's not exactly the same set of leaves, it's a very similar repeating one that's sort of coming down and gradually getting smaller as it goes away from the middle. We often see repeated objects, so the same thing, it may be flipped around, moved up, moved down, slightly smaller, something like that. Lots of flowing curves in these designs, so you'll see that the way that how that they might sort of continue from each other, so one might flow to the left, the next one might flow to the right, and so on and so forth. And in a lot of these things you're going to get a really good sense of balance, and this is one of the more difficult things to achieve when you're creating your own designs, because it does require kind of an innate sense of how to balance something out. So you can see the design at the bottom there, there's lots of slightly different leaves and a tree, but there's just something very well balanced about the whole design, and you'll see that in the the better examples of these things throughout the kind of historical study of them. So now let's move on and start to think about how we sort of take some of this understanding of these shapes and use it to help create our own flourishes within the software. So the first step is to ask yourself some questions. And there are lots of things that you really need to know before you embark on any project within the software, but these are just a guideline of some of the things that you should stop and think about, and maybe make some notes on, start to assemble source material for. Firstly, you need to define what sort of part you're going to make. What style is it? Is it from a particular historical era? What shape are you going to fill? Is it a rectangle? Is it a circle? Is it corners? Is it moulding? Does it have related parts? Are there things that are going to need to echo a particular design across different shapes perhaps? What are the lines of symmetry? So examine your part. Has it got horizontal, vertical symmetry? Are there repeating patterns? Are there things that you're going to be able to use multiple copies of in order to save yourself time? Is there a focus or a center? What sort of balance is the project got? That kind of thing. Is there a particular flow that you're looking for? And ultimately, can you reuse any existing models? So is it possible to take some of the clip art that comes with the software, or clip art you've purchased, or even models that you've created yourself in the past, and repurpose those by altering their design or taking elements from them in order to use in your new design? So having thought about this, let's go back and start to look at the design of some existing flourishes within the context of these questions and really kind of drill down into the different types of symmetry and shapes that we might come across. First thing that you want to do is sort of approximate shapes. So here you can see a set of sketches. These are typical of the type of thing that I might create when I'm looking to think about the shape that I want to fill. So you can see they're just simple rectangles and kind of outlines in order to help me kind of understand the layout. If we examine again particular flourishes, here you can see I've got a corner design here, and I might just create the kind of triangle that fits within. So the aspect ratio, is it a right angle triangle? Has it got a short side? Is it equilateral? So really just thinking about the general shape that I want my flourish to fit in. Here we've got something a little bit more complex that's made up of kind of multiple proportions. So we've got the center part, which has got a thin piece at the bottom, thicker piece at the top, and then this kind of cascading swirl coming out to the side. Again, I can sort of look at that and see that I only need to create one half in order to make the other. We'll look at symmetry in more detail in a moment. And then here I've got a round design, and I might think about the proportions of the middle, the first layer and the second layer, and then also what kind of repeat I've got within here. So I might draw a triangle that helps me represent the fact that I've got to only create 1/6 of this, and then that can be repeated around in order to create my complete design. Next, let's think in more detail about symmetry. And there are different types of symmetry and different ways to examine it. So we have linear symmetry, where we've got kind of left-right or up-down symmetry. In this case, on the image there, you can see the line of symmetry down the middle, and this has got the same thing on the left as it has on the right. So it's essentially the left is a mirror of the right. Then in quite a lot of designs, we might get symmetry in both axes, so both in the horizontal and in the vertical. Again, at this point, I can start to understand that I may only need to create, in this case, 1/4 of the design, or in some cases, I may have additional symmetry, as we'll see in a moment, that makes the proportion that I'm going to create even smaller. Another type of symmetry is rotational symmetry. This is where we take the same object and repeat it around a circle. In this case, we've got a design that has the same thing repeated 6 times. So you can see I've drawn the lines there to give you a sense of where that symmetry occurs. It's important to know how many elements you're going to repeat around the circle, because that will allow you to create suitable guidelines in order to proportion and size your object. Another type of symmetry is what's referred to as dihedral. So essentially this is where you've got both rotational symmetry and or mirrored or linear symmetry. So the design you can see here has got rotational symmetry, but is also mirrored around the different lines you can see in the design there. And again, this is quite typical that the designs that you may come across, particularly to fill a square or a circle, may have dihedral symmetry. Now, some of the things I'm showing you here may appear to be obvious or really basic ideas, and that may be the case. And the reason really that we're looking at these things is because they will save us time if we understand them, because we only need to create a much smaller proportion of our design in the software in order to then make copies, array, mirror, in order to create the complete design. So that's why these are such important fundamental ideas for us when we start to create our own flourishes. Next, let's look at the idea of the kind of typical patterns or repeats that we might find in these types of designs. So we have the sort of standard repeat. So here we've just got the same thing that's being linearly repeated and basically just creating a long horizontal design. Same thing could be done with vertical designs as well. We've got the idea of repeating something but also mirroring it. So here we've got a little triplet of leaves, and that's being repeated but also mirrored as it goes along the kind of wavy vine that's in the background of this design. Repeating and rotating something, so in this case we've effectively taken the same thing and we've just either mirrored that both horizontally and vertically, or more commonly you might find that you've rotated that around the center. It's good to understand though that that is the same thing in this case. For that particular design, if we had the left hand side of it and we mirrored it horizontally and then we mirrored it vertically, as long as that stem is in the center of our part, then we should find that we'd get the same design as if we took it and just rotated it 180 degrees. Finally, we have the idea of repeating something but then maybe overlapping it, so that rather than having a complete set of each one just next to each other or with a space between them, we'll actually take them and the design will require one to sit in front of the other, or at least appear to sit in front of the repeated section next to it. The final area of design we want to think about before we look more specifically at the software tools we'll use to emulate these is the flow and balance. As we mentioned earlier, lots of these flourishes will have a very beautiful curvature to them or a flow, and this is something that you just need to try and think about when doing your layout. So examine existing designs and see how the parts flow, and kind of they have these S curves and C curves and then these more complex kind of scrolls where they're coming in. A lot of them will have proportion to them and geometry behind them, but that's a whole kind of different subject that you'd really need to look into in more detail if you want to learn exactly how that's done. For me, I typically just try and make something that kind of looks pleasing to me when it's done, and I may well iterate quite a lot in order to achieve that. I mentioned proportion there before. A lot of these are based on kind of geometrical rules which have been proven for many years to be very pleasing for humans to see and to find beautiful and to see order in them. One of these is the golden ratio. This is 1.62 to 1. Lots of mathematical properties behind this, lots you can study about this, but you'll often find this within designs like the one you can see there with the two seahorses, where you'll find this proportion of rectangle within the design there, and often repeated over and over in the ways that other things are proportioned together too. This is also used in the calculation of a lot of the kind of spirals that you might find in different flourishes. Finally, less so on the flow and balance, but again on something that provides you with that kind of familiarness in the design, is the idea of looking for these kind of similar motifs, particularly useful in the software, because even though we're looking at slightly different leaves for the design you can see in the bottom right corner there, you'll find that most of those leaves are just a variation on another, and we may well be able to just repeat that in the design and slightly distort it, change it, bend it in order to create something that overall will have a nice flow and balance to it, because we've got the same thing just very slightly modified throughout our entire layout. So having studied some of the design elements we need to think about and some of the construction, what are the specific software tools that will help us achieve these shapes? The first and probably most basic is just taking an object, copying it, pasting it, and then moving it in order to repeat it. In a similar way, we can also use the array tool. So we have a linear array for creating many copies in a line or a grid, or we have the rotational array, as you can see with the example on the right here, where we've taken a single copy of this leaf and then just made 4 rotated copies around a center point. As we start to overlap objects, we want them to appear so that one sits in front of the other. To do that, we can use the tilt and the fade tool on our components in order to raise and lower them in the area that they're going to overlap. Probably one of the most often used tools we might find ourselves working with is the mirror command. We discussed the idea of symmetry in a design, and for linear symmetry that's exactly what the mirror command does. We can mirror about the center or mirror about a line depending what types of shapes we're trying to construct. Another tool that we're going to find useful is the ability to take a single component or a set of components and extrude them along a vector in order to create things like arches or curves. This also might be used as you get into much more complex layouts by taking a simple motif and bending it around to create the curvature and flow that we were discussing before. In the companion videos in this section, you'll see me extensively demonstrating the actual use of these tools within the software on real components. Next, I want to think about the idea of why we might want to edit clip art. So obviously if I'm working with a spire, I can model shapes from scratch, I can build my own leaves, flowers, scroll work, any of the other shapes we've looked at if I have the necessary knowledge and experience to do that. Often though, there is a great deal of clip art that you could use as source material in order to create new flourishes. This is good because you can customize it to fit your application. So you may have a piece of clip art that's not quite the right shape, but if you start to take pieces from that and reassemble them, then you can make that work for the application that you have now. Because we're using an existing model, we'll get a themed look and size. So everything is already kind of in proportion and has the same theme when it's been used in an existing piece of clip art. So by taking it and effectively remixing it into different designs, we know we're going to maintain that theme and look across all the different layouts that we may create. Now, as long as our original model is good quality, then we know as we start to edit that and change it, then we're going to maintain that quality and look and feel about the design. It's easy to create many iterations. Again, in the companion videos, you'll see me take an object and create a number of different layouts from it, and any of those can be saved at any time in order to just add to my clip art library. And this can be much faster than starting from scratch. If I can take an existing leaf or flower or ribbon or something like that and use that in a different design, then I've completely shortcutted the process of having to draw all the vectors out in order to create that design myself. So now we understand the benefits of editing an existing piece of clip art. How do we do that? Basically, the first step is to take your model and divide it up into manageable pieces that you can use to create a new layout. Again, there is a companion video in this section that shows you the processes that I'm about to discuss here. The theory behind the practice though is as follows. So firstly, I'm typically going to start with an extremely high-res model. Now this is not one of the standard options when you first start a spire. So what you need to do is hold down the Shift key when you click Create a New Job, and then it will become one of the options that you get in the resolution settings. Now the software will run slower as it does its calculations because of this extra number of pixels that I'm using to represent the model. But the nice thing is it'll really maintain the quality as I start to break this up into different pieces. So that's just something I like to do, although it'll make it a little bit slower for me to work with. Next, we'll make copies of our components, so we've always got an original that we can go back to as we start to break it up into different pieces. Then I'm going to draw very accurate vectors that I can use to start to split or crop different areas of the model away. And you can see in the image there, you can get quite a complicated set of vectors on a model like the one I'm showing you here, where you start to divide up the different pieces. Now it's important these vectors are very good quality because they'll define the edge of your new components. Next, we're going to think about the logical pieces we want to divide this up into. So you'll think about, as I've color coded here, individual bits that may be useful to you to use in a different design or a different layout. So sometimes you might go down into quite small sections of the design before you stop dividing it up into pieces. It just really depends what you're planning to do with it. Finally, as we start to chop these pieces up, some bits of them may be missing, or the ends may have a very kind of serrated edge where we've cut them with a vector. So it's important to finish these edited parts. So that may use the sculpting tools, where you're going to erase areas by using the undo and the shift key, or smooth and smudge edges in order to clean up ones that have got a very sharp edge where we crop them. Also, we may need to model missing areas, so sometimes we might need to join up parts in order to finish them off or create fills within an area too. Last thing we might want to do is just take our sharp edges and just round them off again, going back to using the sculpting tools. So the rectangles in the image on the bottom right there are showing you all the areas for this design that I had to go in and clean up subsequent to starting to cropping those different pieces. So as I mentioned, there is a companion video in this section that shows us this process and how to do some of these techniques. In that, we're going to start with the model you can see here, and we're basically going to take that and divide it up into the pieces that you can see at the bottom there. Certainly we may not show all of those, but we'll show you all the techniques you need to use in order to be able to create those. From there, effectively, we've got a toolbox that we can use in order to create our own new layout. So from that one model, I can create all the different variations that you can see there, and really an infinite number of other variations as well. And again, there's a companion video where we'll look at how to generate a number of those designs and start to bring together all the different techniques that we've discussed in this example, and then also looked at in the other companion videos too. So let's summarize some of the things that we've been talking about. As you're going to see in the videos, and as we've discussed on the last few slides, the software has a very powerful toolset that is very much suited to this kind of work, where we might take an existing object, break it into pieces, and then create something new from it. All the tools we've got for mirroring and repeating and doing tilting and fading to overlap the different parts are an excellent toolbox for us to do this type of layout. When you start to think about your design, you should really plan the layout that you want. So look for areas where you've got the symmetry, where you can use those tools, the patterns, the features, and then when you get into the software, we're going to use guides and vectors to help us with the construction for these. And again, the layout of those is extremely important because they can save you lots and lots of time if you do it right. Use existing clipart if you can. It's going to be faster than starting from scratch and creating your own models, and by using something that you already know looks good, you can create consistency and theme across your design. Save iterations as you go. That'll help you to build your model library and just make this process easier and easier as you get more designs to choose from. And finally, study existing designs. There is so much material on the internet, on historical buildings, in books, and you can learn how the old masters did it by trying to look for some of the features that I've pointed out here. So start to look at where the repeats are, where the lines of symmetry are. Is it rotational or linear symmetry? And then if you want to, you can get into much more detailed study about the geometrical layout of the different schools of architecture and design. And in that regard, I would like to recommend one particular book that I found very useful to help me understand some of the construction behind these things, and also with some excellent visual references as well. Book's called Design A or Designer. I'm not quite sure how they pronounce it there. Publisher is Wooden Books. You can find it on websites like Amazon. Retails for around $15, maybe £13, £14, something like that. So highly recommend that. It's a very nice little book, and well worth having in your library if you're interested in this type of work. That concludes this video. Please go ahead and watch the companion videos to this if you haven't already, to see some of the things we've talked about in practice.